G'day and welcome to Does It Matter? It's Kareem here again. Um, Checking out the news as per usual, and I've noticed a few juxtapositions that don't sit well with me, so I thought I'd bring them up with you and see what you think. Um, Recently in Australia, in South Australia in particular, we had a whole bunch of politicians who decided that for whatever reasons that they had, they're all wealthy, they're all from fairly privileged homes and backgrounds as well. Um, None of them were struggling for a dollar, let's just say that, like so many people at the moment. But they decided that they were going to engage in what looks like outright fraud to me. I don't know how you could describe it as anything separate to that. And the juxtaposition that didn't sit well with me wasn't simply that we've got politicians, whoopee-doo, they do it all the time, unfortunately, but defrauding the public and ripping off embezzling public monies, or stealing at the very least, was that we in Australia are putting 10 to 13-year-old children in prison. We jail children. How a 10-year-old in any conceivable world has the maturity, the scope of understanding, the knowledge of consequence, the ethical understanding to grasp what incarceration means for them, not only there and then, but in the future. I'm sure that there are some astonishingly clever little savants and highly intelligent kids from very privileged backgrounds who might well be able to make that leap. However, expecting people from impoverished, horrible backgrounds, often from dysfunctional families, from dysfunctional districts, to be able to be responsible, personally responsible, to be accountable for that level of understanding, it blows my mind. There's no conceivable way within my understanding. I only did a couple of years of psychology at university, but I've also worked with the public, including youth, for decades. And people's understanding of some of these factors, even as adults, is quite limited. People often don't know the law. They don't understand their rights and their responsibilities. So to suggest that children have this understanding and should go to jail, particularly when they usually come from both Indigenous and impoverished backgrounds. So they're the ones with the least capacity, the least support network, the poorest heuristic for understanding what it is they're doing and what that means for them and society as a whole. They don't have that heuristic. It's not there. You have to learn it. And if you're damaged, not only ignorant, but damaged because of your upbringing, then you have no capacity to do that. We'll come back to that later. So on the one hand, we have children who have limited to no capacity to actually grasp what it is that they're being held to account for. And on the other side of things, we have politicians who get to just resign from their cabinet leadership, go back to their cushy MP positions because they haven't lost their jobs as politicians for rorting the public purse. No, they're just not cabinet ministers anymore. It's a scam. And the injustice of it blows my mind. And anyone who knows me knows I'm no SJW running around with a victim mentality. But there are genuine injustices in the world and they need to be highlighted. And this is definitely in Australia one of them. We jail children who have very little capacity to none in many cases. The worst and most vulnerable of our kids, we throw them in jail and doom them to a life of repeat abuse forever. Okay, and they become abusive to us as well as a result. We're creating a rod for our own backs. And yet at the same time, we allow ministers who steal money knowingly, and I'll show that in a minute in the article, steal money knowingly from the public. And they're from the most privileged, fortunate backgrounds that exist in our society. And these guys get a pass. They get a pass. They get to keep their jobs. They should go to jail. They should be under house arrest. They should be punished severely. It's an incredible abuse of the public trust. It's not simply that they stole, they betrayed the people that they've agreed to protect and look after. And for their own personal advancement. These are people who come from wealthy families largely. These are people who earn a very good income, 150,000 plus a year, plus a rafter of free travel and accommodation benefits and all kinds of things, which they have been shown to abuse. They get nothing. They lose a cabinet position. Whoopee-doo. That's like this. That should be the first step. They should be sacked. They should be put in jail. Anyway, we'll come back to that. So what I'll show you on this article is that we'll look at the way that we incarcerate children in this country, and I want you to hold that in your minds, juxtapose it against what's happened to these poor politicians. Okay. Oh, I lost all my underlinings. That's okay. Look, the age of criminal responsibility in Australia is 10. Yeah, I was blown away by that too. I couldn't understand it. The minimum age of criminal responsibility in Australia is 10. In 2019, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Children recommended 14 as the minimum age of criminal responsibility. Peak bodies representing youth advocates, doctors, lawyers began urging Australia's top legal officers to raise the minimum age of criminal responsibility before a meeting of the Council of Attorneys General, CAG. Now, New South Wales Attorney General Mark Speakman said it was unlikely that these reforms would be made until the final report was submitted to the Council in 2021 next year. Made some excuses about how, with 9 different jurisdictions, it's going to be awfully hard to get a consensus. Not that he's too particularly unhappy about that. He said he was yet to be personally convinced that these reforms were needed. This is a principal issue about whether you raise the age of criminal responsibility at all. But if you do, you need to know what is the alternative regime. Actually, no, you don't. No, you don't. That's a sideways step, typical political sideways step. You don't need to know what the alternative is yet. What you need to establish first is whether something is right or wrong, whether something is effective or ineffective. And it is both ineffective and wrong. So, no, we don't. This is the typical political speak, typical double speak of politicians. No, we need to work out some alternative first. It's the same way they've sidestepped climate change, environmental issues. It's the same way that some of them try to sidestep the necessary lockdowns because of economic consequences, constantly going, oh, we need an alternative. We need to know what we're going to do afterwards. Yeah, we do. No one disagrees with that. But that shouldn't preclude you actually stopping the bad behaviour, the bad policy, the ineffective policy first. Stop that first, because the principle behind government should be the same as the principle behind doctoring. First, do no harm. All right? Government shouldn't do harm in order to look like they're doing something. And that's often what happens. We've got to do something, so they do something, and it hurts people. But it looks good because they look like they're out there enforcing order and stability, or whatever it is that they think they're trying to order. But they're doing harm, and they're creating instabilities and further future instabilities that will come back to haunt us and bite us in the financial butt as well. He thinks, I think it is ambitious to raise the age to 14 without any carve-outs. We remain to be convinced, but the reason further work is being done is so if people want to convince us they can. God, he can't speak properly either. So if people want to convince us they can, well, I doubt very much. It sounds like he's got pretty much a existing bias. Justin Muhammad from the Victoria's Commission for Aboriginal Children and Young People said the response by Australians, in general, us, is encouraging. The system needs to change now. He said we need to raise the age of criminal responsibility to 14 or above, and instead support children at that age so they stay out of the criminal system. Yeah. What a novel idea. Don't criminalise children. Don't take children before they're fully formed and throw them in the pokey so that they become institutionally bound up and they grow up, their brain hardens into their 20s, which is what happens to all of us. Okay, the brain solidifies around a particular identity and then they're stuck with that for the rest of their lives. And if they want to change it, it is immensely more difficult as an adult than as a child. So we're taking people in the most vulnerable but also most flexible state of being that they'll ever have. Their capacity to learn, the capacity to change is never better than 10 to 18 years of age. Never better. They're flexible. And we're going to throw them in an institution where they will be formed around those lines, those penal lines. Oh, well, that'll work really wonderfully for the rest of us. Stupid, blatantly stupid and short-sighted. In the November last year, Federal Attorney General Christian Porter said he was not overly enthusiastic about the reform, but acknowledged the view of the states and territories may differ. But in my personal observation, pontificating, more likely, historically there have been instances where it is appropriate to prosecute people who have been under the age of 14 for various serious offences if it can be established they had the requisite level of mental clarity to understand the crime that was committed was both morally wrong and also contrary to the law, Mr. Porter said. He thinks the system works reasonably well. Now, this is where I come in with another, just understanding that you did something wrong that society doesn't approve of is only the first step in actually fairly prosecuting a person for their culpability in committing a crime. You also have to establish, were they capable of making any other choice? Did they have the emotional and mental capacity and emotional responsibility, i.e. personal discipline, personal habits, moral framework? Did they have that? Did they know it? Have they learnt it in order to do the right thing? I mean, people do the right thing to some degree instinctively, but an awful lot of it is indoctrination. We are taught, we are indoctrinated, we are educated and inculcated by our parents in a moral and ethical framework. And to suggest that a 10-year-old has a full understanding of that, particularly an impoverished 10-year-old or a 13-year-old who's come from a severely dysfunctional background, is specious to say the least. We're ignoring the fact that even if a child knows they've done something wrong, that's not that difficult to work out. It's the low-hanging fruit of standards for deciding whether someone's guilty or not. Did they know they were doing wrong? Of course they probably knew they were doing wrong. No one steals without knowing they're stealing. No one commits a violent act, embezzles, lies, or thieves without knowing. Even a 5-year-old will probably have some understanding that they were doing that. So yes, that's the low-hanging fruit. Oh, well, they knew what they were doing. In the pokey. That's what we're doing in many cases. Thank goodness our judiciary have some leeway so far, all right? And some of them at least show some common sense and some understanding of the nuance of this situation rather than trying to impose some binary sense of ethics onto small children. We believe that, Pauline Wright, President of the Law Council of Australia, said that we believe that criminalising and detaining children as young as 10 is not tenable and it doesn't work to stop the bad behaviour. Ms Wright said as an alternative to criminalisation, the family court could impose supervision or care orders. Yeah, that seems super logical. They're children. What would work for children? What would work for children who come from these particular backgrounds? What would work for children who suffered these particular abuses and neglect? What would work for children who have these deficits that need to be addressed while they still can be easily addressed? Because once they're adults, it becomes immensely harder. And now you're doing it within the penal system, which itself is not at all successful in rehabilitating people. You only have to look at our 67 to 80 odd plus recidivism rate over a 5 to 10 year period to realise that most criminals stay criminals all their lives. Okay, we're dog shit at healing people and redeeming people. We're terrible at it. And there are countries like Norway and Sweden and Holland that have a far lower recidivism rates, like 17 to 20%, okay, within a 5-year period, not 67 to 80 odd percent, depending on which state you go to. All right, they are far better at it than us. And the second time around, the recidivism rate drops in many cases in most of those countries to well above, to well under 5%. So if they stuff up again, they don't usually stuff up a third time. Whereas in Australia, we have the revolving door of lifelong criminals, hundreds of thousands of them. So the issue of youth incarceration was recently highlighted in a documentary which aired on the ABC called My Blood It Runs. Very good, well worth the watch. Psychologist and Nyamal woman Tracy Westerman, who's the managing director of Indigenous Psychological Services, said the normalisation of criminality at an early age was robbing children of their possible futures, something I've been saying for a bit now. As a child welfare officer in Western Australia many years ago, Dr. Westerman said she had seen really horrific examples of children being criminalised for being unlucky enough to be born into circumstances of poverty. Children were effectively being locked up for stealing food. Food! They're stealing food and they're being locked up for Mars bars and stuff like that. The 3 strikes and you're out rules that we had a while back. Absolutely disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. So you see that in a highlight. You see that these children are being jailed. They're being held to the lowest possible standard of judgment. Oh, did they know that they were doing something wrong? Yep, straight to the pokey. What? Did they understand what that meant? Were they capable of changing that behaviour? Were they capable of making the adjustments necessary within their ethical and behavioural framework to avoid that sin, that evil thing that they did? Were they hungry? Does hunger justify stealing? In my opinion, yes. Should you steal? Are there better options than stealing? Absolutely. Does a 10-year-old necessarily understand that from an impoverished and dysfunctional background? Probably not. Do they have the emotional strength and the personal discipline and rigor of mind to actually do anything other than what they do? Probably not. And study after study in psychology, social psychology, clinical psychology shows that over and over again. Children don't have that capacity. In fact, it's arguable that adults who've suffered extreme trauma, who've suffered brain damage, which is common in these kinds of backgrounds, who've been raised with fetal alcohol syndrome, a whole range of other things, they're incapable of actually truly understanding the magnitude of their crimes. And they need to be treated differently. Do I want to soft pedal everyone that ever does a terrible crime? Not at all, no. But we do need to look at other options other than simply jailing people for doing things wrong when they're 10 to 13 years of age. It's disgusting. It should be 15 or 16 at least. I think personally we're jailing a lot of people who should be in mental institutions, who should be getting help, who should be getting an opportunity to be healed from their mental and emotional illnesses. I think that people who end up in the jail system should have the opportunity to be rehabilitated, to be repaired. All right. If we don't fix people, we end up with lifelong problems. Lifelong. And that becomes everyone's problem. We make a rod for our own backs. Now, by contrast, looking at the 3 ministers who've resigned in South Australia from the state's state cabinet, Mr. Stefan Knoll, Tim Whetstone, and Trade Minister David Ridgway, these gentlemen were engaged in levels of misappropriation that staggers me. Opposition leader Peter Malinauskas said it had been an extraordinary day in South Australian politics, adding that Mr. Marshall, Premier Marshall, should have issued the ministers with sanctions before dismissing them. Instead, he's accepted their resignations in the desperate hope that the whole issue just goes away. Stephen Marshall has tried to categorise this as a distraction, but it's not a distraction, it's a scandal. Labor's Tom Koutsantonis said an analysis of documents had revealed that Mr. Knoll claimed a total of 20 nights dating back to 2014 worth $4,406 by signing claim forms before the expenses were incurred. That's you're not allowed to do that. If I did that working for any of the companies or government departments I work for, not only would I have been sacked, I would have been prosecuted. They would have pursued me legally. There's a very good chance I would have ended up with a criminal record and a conviction for that alone. Now, it's not the end of it. He said that Mr. Whetstone had also claimed 8 nights worth $1,758 in advance. Again, in advance, before they've happened. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to do it after the fact, not before. No other workplace in Australia tolerates this type of behaviour, where ministers can put in applications to get paid in advance of actually incurring the expenses, Mr. Constantonis said. What we're seeing now is ministers sitting down, planning in advance days where they want to claim this money. This isn't inadvertent, this is deliberate. On Saturday, Mr. Ridgway also admitted to signing blank timesheets for his chauffeur while he was away overseas. So he's spreading the wealth, so to speak. But he's encouraging dishonesty even within his employees at the public expense. Thanks, Mr. Ridgway. On Thursday, South Australia's Independent Commissioner Against Corruption, ICAC, Bruce Lander, confirmed he will be examining 10 years of allowances paid to country MPs. The $234 per night members' accommodation allowance is only payable to regional MPs whose homes are more than 75 k's from Adelaide, for when they are required to spend a night in the city on official business. Both houses of parliament released 10 years' worth of allowance records on Tuesday, prompting 5 Liberal MPs to amend the dates they claimed it, and 3 of those MPs were paying a total of more than $70,000. So the rot goes deep, and I suspect over the coming months we're going to see more and more MPs fall afoul of this. Documents relating to the crimes remain secret until they were released earlier this week after an ABC investigation into eligibility of some MPs. So Mr. Knoll, Mr. Whetstone and backbencher Fraser Ellis have also agreed to repay more than 70 grand. It's been revealed that Ministers Knoll and Whetstone billed taxpayers tens of thousands of dollars for regional, interstate and overseas travel, and get this, on the same days they incorrectly claimed the allowance. Same days. So essentially, these people get to keep their jobs. Now they get demotion, for stealing tens of thousands of dollars and doing it knowingly, breaking the rules knowingly, willingly. One of them even encouraged his employee to do the same thing, or did it for him, actually. This is fraud. This is grand fraud. It's a serious crime. And yet, I sincerely doubt that any of them will ever suffer any more censure than what they've already suffered. Because it's not in the political interest of the Premier, Mr. Marshall, to do that. But the reality is that while kids in NT and WA and SA go to jail as young as 13, 12, 10, 12, 11, 12, 13, 14, they go to jail for substantially more minor crimes in most cases than this. Grown adults from privileged backgrounds who have no excuse, who are fully accountable for their actions, have been caught stealing, and all they get is effectively a slap on the wrist, go back to the backbenchers. In a few years' time, they could probably go for another cabinet position because there is nothing to prevent that happening. There's nothing to prevent when everything dies down in a few years' time, provided you keep your seat, we can slide you back into the cabinet. These are senior ministers. These are senior members of the party. They're not going to stay down forever. That's not the way politics works. So you have a clear example here. Children getting thrown in jail without any kind of reasonable and proper assessment by medical authorities and psychological authorities as to what their capacity actually is, using the low-hanging fruit of did they know they were doing something wrong, as if that was a good enough standard for anything or anyone. And on the other hand, you have ministers from the elite ranks of society able to steal at will, and they don't even lose their job, let alone face criminal proceedings for their misappropriations, for their fraud. That's social injustice. That's economic injustice. And that's something we need to address here in SA and in Australia, full stop. Have a little think about it. If you think it's worth doing something about, I ask you to send a tersely worded email to the appropriate authorities. You could send it to CAG, to the Attorney General's Commission. You could send it to the state government or the federal government as well. Look, any one of your MPs, even just your own local MPs, send it to them. Say, this isn't good enough. Children shouldn't be in jail, and politicians shouldn't be able to steal and not suffer the same consequences that any one of us would suffer. If I stole from my work, and I work as a contractor for the government, if I stole from my work, I would be prosecuted heavily. They would make sure my life was ruined. And yet, politicians get the easy slide path back into the backbenches for a while. And I guarantee at least one of them will be back in cabinet one day. Cheers. Thanks very much.